Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Season 2 of the ESG Experience podcast, brought to you by Gobi, the ESG platform. I'm Helee Lev, Gobi's Chief Revenue Officer.
And I'm Ryan Nelson, Gobi's CEO. And we're your hosts for this podcast today. Welcome to Season 2.
Whether you're an ESG expert or just dipping your toes in the ESG universe to understand how it can help with engaging stakeholders, mitigating risks, and attracting investors, this podcast is for you. Together, we'll navigate the alphabet soup of ESG, discuss ideas, review strategies, and share industry news and trends. In this episode, we will be discussing driving purpose in business with an increasingly remote-first workforce. We are very pleased to be joined today by Susan Hunt-Stevens, founder and CEO of WeSpire. Susan, WeSpire is an award-winning employee experience technology that drives environmental, social, and governance outcomes by engaging people in activities that align with their passion and purpose. After her son was diagnosed with serious food allergies, she founded WeSpire to leverage her digital behavior change expertise and help people embrace healthier and more sustainable lifestyles and create a more equitable and inclusive work culture. Susan was named EY Entrepreneur of the Year for New England, a Woman of Influence by Boston Business Journal, and the Environmental Leader 100 list. Prior to WeSpire, she spent 9 years at the New York Times Company, most recently as SVP General Manager for Boston.com, a $60 million digital media division. She has an MBA from Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth, where she was named a Tuck Scholar and graduated with high honors from Wesleyan University. Wow, that's impressive. And probably uncomfortable as someone reads all of your accolades out to tens of thousands of listeners. Yeah, maybe less uncomfortable. I'll describe what your company does, or actually, no, probably even better. Maybe you want to describe directly what your company does.
Sure. If you are a large company, you are probably engaging your employees in a number of different initiatives already. You might have a volunteering program. You probably have some sort of matching gift program. You might have employee resource groups. You might be getting people involved in well-being, whether it's a STEPS challenge or something related to meditation, mindfulness, or even financial well-being. And you might be trying to get people engaged in your sustainability efforts. And the way you were doing this 10 years ago is that you were putting table tent cards in the cafeteria and you were holding lunch and learns and you were maybe having guest speakers come in, or you might have a 1-month challenge getting everybody to recycle and bring in bins for hard to recycle things. And it was all offline, all highly engaging, but very difficult to scale, particularly for larger companies. So what WeSpire does is we offer a technology platform where you can take all those activities and put them in through the technology and publish it out to your intranet, your mobile app, your email systems, your social platforms like Teams or Slack, so that people can participate digitally in these programs, register for the volunteering events, participate in a vampire energy scavenger hunt, join an ERG and sign up for things. And then as a result of doing this, the content can be very targeted based on a person's role, their location, their tenure, or other things that they're interested in. And then you also can measure the impact of what's happening. How many people are participating? What are they doing? What's the environmental impact of that? What's the social impact of that? But most excitingly, is this having any impact on culture? And what I'm most proud of is that companies who use our technology can say, wow, employees who are getting involved in our volunteering initiative retain 37 percentage points better than employees who don't in a retail environment. And that's a real statistic. That's transformative culture. And what this is doing, I think, is taking these programs out of the realm of being the right thing to do and making them into what they really are, which is a strategic, critical component of your culture for getting the kind of outcomes that you want related to likelihood to recommend the company, retain the company, and even performance.
I love that. So you're not taking away the charm or the allure of the grassrootsness of some of these initiatives, but you're making them scalable and attainable and really have a bigger impact than if they were just grassroots, but still have that character.
Exactly. And targeted, because, you don't want to get a bunch of emails about an employee volunteering event that's taking place in Southern California if you're in the New York office. You don't want to necessarily, some countries, are going to want to be involved in a giving effort that's around climate efforts and mitigations and disasters that are happening in their local area, not giving to a US-based not-for-profit. So it's a global platform that enables hyper-localization and hyper-targeting of the programs and the content, and that makes it more effective.
Yeah, we really appreciate what you're doing. On behalf of everyone, we appreciate what you're doing and think it's very cool. And I really enjoyed learning about WeSpire and doing some of the engagement surveys that you have on the site. So very cool stuff. It reminds me of the concept of, what was it? Maybe IBM said or somebody, but think globally, act locally. Kind of reminds me of that.
Absolutely.
Have the whole program, but it's got to be somewhat focused. And we know from your career, scaling is, for us, it's just one of the hardest things to do. I mean, having a great idea, rolling it out to a dozen people, a couple dozen people, 100-person company is one thing, but scaling is one of the hardest things to do and keep the value and all of that. So clearly you work with some large customers. You've built this platform for scalability. You have customers that are very large. You talked about some of the way that it's done tactically, but in general, maybe you could tell us what is the shift that you've seen? Is it from 2020, 2021? Has there been a dramatic shift in how companies are approaching ESG today? Could you have sold this to companies 10 years ago? Is it easier now? What's it like?
I certainly couldn't have sold integrated ESG 10 years ago. When we got started running the sustainability programs, and we sat next to, inside any individual organization, a different team in a different department that was running philanthropy, and a different team in a different department that was running D&I, and a different team in a different department that was running, health and safety or well-being or whatever it's called. And the four groups barely talked to each other, let alone operated in an integrated way. And that was fine. We lived in and had a very little successful silo over in sustainability. There's been really two catalytic changes in the last 10 years. The first was actually the advent of the UN SDGs in the 2015-2016 timeframe. And unlike prior efforts, the business community was engaged much more by the UN and the constituents in the UN in setting these sustainable development goals. And there were a lot more global companies signing on and stating their own SDG goals and SDG commitments. And what we saw happen is when they did that, they started recognizing that the SDGs were touching on climate, health and well-being, equity. And these groups now needed to talk together more and more. And that often what would happen is a client who had been the chief sustainability officer would become the chief responsibility officer, and they would pull things together underneath that individual. And it differed by company. In some cases, well-being was part of it. In some cases, it wasn't. D&I was another area that sometimes was or wasn't. But the two that came together most notably were sustainability and CSR. And when you think about reporting, and even this move towards integrated reporting, sustainability and CSR and these items are starting to come together. So that was the first real shift. And that was the shift that said, we need to support our clients who are now have other responsibilities. They're looking at these tech platforms and saying, WeSpire, we like what you do better. You're very behavior-based, you're very targeted, you're very much about motivating and activation. A lot of these are tracking and reporting, and nobody really even wants to track their hours. They don't, they don't upload their matches. This is kind of a pain. So asked if we would get into doing CSR. So we added that in 2017. And then I had a client who had D&I who asked if we could start running campaigns in D&I. So we started adding a module around D&I. ESG really hit about 2 years ago, 3 years ago is when I think finally the combination of employee activism around these topics and investor inquiry around these topics got this out of being kind of in the specialist department into becoming a C-suite conversation and saying oh my goodness, I have to go answer all these questions and fill out all these reports for investors about what we're doing with D&I, what we're doing around mental health and well-being, what we're doing around sustainability and climate. And I don't know what to say, you know? And part of this is a reporting challenge and just getting the reporting. But I see a lot of it as a storytelling challenge. What is it that we're doing? And how do I make sure that the work we are doing, we are getting credit for? And if we're not doing the work, we're being held accountable to start doing it. And I think getting the employees involved is the way that you embed this into your culture. And it is the way that ultimate incredible stories come out about everything from innovation to risk management to business value. And I think capitalist at heart, in the sense that I know businesses have been doing this for a long time, but they aren't going to put real time, real money, and real resources from a human capital standpoint around it until they can make the triple bottom line case that this is not only good for people, this is not only good for the planet, but this is good for profit. And so I think the case that not only having strong ESG frameworks broadly is good for business, but that engaging employees in ESG is good for business had to be made to see this shift for it becoming a must-do activity, not a nice-to-do activity.
Yeah, that's definitely in line with what we're seeing as well. And as much as, we're altruistic people and we're mission-based and we love ESG, you got to be a bit more than a tree hugger, right? You got to be business-minded, and you have to get in the heads of the people that you're trying to change. So you said something interesting just now about, measuring employee retention, or actually showing people that in addition to ESG driving bottom line profit, perhaps it does help with employee retention. And I had read a blog post that you wrote earlier today, how ESG programs can combat the Great Resignation. So it's definitely something that we've seen in our company as far as, the Great Resignation impacting our business from a standpoint of people either leaving to pursue their dreams in music, or people, who are getting hounded by recruiters and just hopping, for that 10, 15K raise. So how is it that ESG programs can combat the Great Resignation and drive employee retention? And then how do you measure that to the point of, you have to demonstrate to folks that this is good for your bottom line? How do you actually measure that because of this program, as a result of your ESG initiatives, your employee retention improved?
Yeah. So we've been doing a state of employee engagement and ESG report for almost 10 years. And we go out and we survey thousands of employees, not just at our clients, but broadly. And so we actually had this data around the importance of ESG going into COVID, not just now. And what we knew from that data is that if employees believe that their company is making a positive difference in this world, only 7%, like a single digit percent, are actively looking for a new role. If people do not believe that their company is making a strong positive impact in this world, nearly 50% are looking and open to a new role. And so
wow, that's staggering.
It's a staggering difference if they believe their company is doing something. And that was going into COVID. I liken COVID more to the great recalibration, not necessarily the Great Resignation. The resignation is the outcome. What's happening is a major recalibration around values, interests, geographies, cares, goals, and all of this. And so I think what's happening is people are really looking through a new lens and a new values filter for work, and the kind of work they want. And that value lens might, lean hard towards flexibility. It might lean hard towards, autonomy and the ability to, kind of own their role. But a lot of it is leaning into purpose and feeling like, wow, this world has so many huge, giant problems facing it. If I can find a job where I'm helping solve those problems and get paid to do it, that's something really, really exciting for me. And, we see it as a beneficiary, because all these incredible engineers who might have been putting their talents towards, building companies that drive advertising, or building companies that drive financial services returns, are saying, how can I be an engineer that's actually solving climate? How can I be an engineer that's actually solving racial equity and injustice. And when you can bring those things together, I think those companies that are purpose and mission driven are going to attract more talent. And certainly for those people who care about mission and purpose, which are many people, particularly young people as a career, they're going to stay. I think it's a giant wake-up call to any company who was able to operate by being a good place to work, fair pay, even some of the culture things around flexibility and autonomy and things like that, but weren't really thinking, what's my purpose and what am I doing to make the world a better place each and every day? And we've worked with some large companies who have made this purpose adjustment, and it's not easy. We've worked with companies who did an incredible job externally at really, aligning around a key strategy that's tied to purpose and impact, but they didn't bring their employees with them. And so they would attract all these folks who were really excited. And then they would get there and they'd be like, this is no different than this competitor who doesn't claim to be these things. The job is the job. It's just not. And so how you bring your culture with you when you're setting a purpose becomes really, really important, because if you're out saying you're very mission driven and purpose driven, but each and every day people show up and it looks just like being at a competitor who's not, you're going to suffer almost the worst consequences because you claimed you were something different.
I have a theory. Tell me what you think about this, or someone put this theory in my head, or I read about it, or whatever. But is this the great recalibration? Is, as you use, I think is great. It feels like it was almost necessary or inevitable. Like we were heading towards so much, we were traveling too much. We were literally like, oh, if there's a meeting, I'll just be there in person. Oh, and then I'll be at the next meeting in person. So I'll go to New York, and then I'll go to California the next day, and then I'll go there, and then I'll go there. And, health and well-being and all these things. So the way that they were driven was so hard almost that we had to like recalibrate and go, wait a second, we just can't keep functioning like this. It's, it had to be recalibrated in a way for us to even survive, for the economy to effectively work and have the human capital and resources to continue to function in it. I felt like there almost needed to be a recalibration.
Yeah. And what I point to is that the trends that we see today were trends that started before COVID, way before COVID. The purpose-driven business movement, has been something, I think, what Larry's first letter that woke up 97% of S&P 500 companies, because they own more than 5% of 97%. It was in 2018, I believe. Jamie Dimon's letter from the Business Roundtable, that was before COVID. So this movement towards understanding that business needs to have purpose in addition to profit was that train had left the station way before COVID. Employees wanting to work for companies that had that were a force for good in this world. That's something that you were hearing through the explosion of net impact chapters on campuses and business schools, the rise of the number of students that were pursuing MBAs with a sustainable business focus, or going to, the Ross School Positive Business Institute. So I just think COVID accelerated dramatically the trajectory for many of these trends. They were gonna, to your point, happen anyway. It just happened faster, and it woke people up in a much more abrupt manner to ask some of these fundamental questions about work, about life, about values, about priorities. And the good news is that there's now businesses for you to go to and work for. And I think that's also changed. Like we just converted to be a public benefit corp. When we first incorporated, there was no public benefit corp in Delaware. It didn't exist. And now there's thousands and thousands of B Corps, which are businesses that have sort of this sense of force for good in this world as part of their founding charter. And so I think this idea that you can be for profit and be for impact, is kind of colliding with these trends all at the same time and giving people a lot more choices. And ultimately, choice is always, always good for change.
Do you remember, do either of you remember, it was before Facebook, what was that like app where you would go around and you would get badges. You could become the mayor of a location if you went.
Foursquare.
Foursquare, was it? Yeah, that's right.
Foursquare.
So that was one of the first times I really fully consumed the idea of gamification and like how powerful it was. Like I was like, oh my gosh, I'm 2 visits away from possibly being the mayor of that sandwich shop or whatever. I should go there today. Like it was wild for me, gamification and bringing it to the corporate world and using it throughout the day. Can you give us, are there any good stories or specific games that you know an organization has played that has been successful in there in that fashion?
Yeah. So the whole field of gamification and gamification for good, which WeSpire is a big pioneer in. There's been a lot of books written about us. I teach in the gamification course in Coursera that Kevin Werbach from Wharton teaches. Is the idea of taking game mechanics, things that happen in games, whether that was a check-in game like Foursquare or Worlds of Warcraft or Mario Kart, and applying them to real world applications. And what we know is that there are certain prototypes, certain archetypes of people who respond very, very well to game mechanics. They label us as achievers. I am a hardcore achiever in that. And so things like points and leaderboards and measurement and mechanics and levels and all of this does change our behavior. And so I often joke that I got the idea for WeSpire while I was sitting in a sustainable design class at the Boston Architectural College. I was personally passionate about sustainability, but in my day job, the New York Times was asked to be one of the first brands to have a Facebook page. And when they were showing us how this is all going to work, some of the apps they showed us were things like Farmville. I don't know if you remember Farmville, and all of this used a lot of these game mechanics and things like that. And then we were studying the LEED system for green building, which I don't expect you to know a ton about, but the short version is you get points for making a building more sustainable. And then you get a badge to stick on the building that says that it's, silver or gold or platinum LEED certified. It's a game system.
Irony there, Gobi was started as a LEED consulting shop. So
perfect. Then you absolutely know about the LEED system if you were started as
but
that.
Actually never thought about it in that context of gamification. Never thought about it, but that's exactly what it is.
The competition.
It's a game.
For building things.
There's points, there's awards, there's levels.
Badges, the whole 9 yards. It's a gamified system for how to build things more sustainably. And so I kind of went the ding, ding, ding went off in my head. And the working name for WeSpire was Lead for Daily Living to start with. And of course, it's expanded way beyond that and into lots of other things. But it is this idea that if we put game mechanics around it, it's very powerful for those of us who are achievers. Now, ironically, the most powerful group in a workplace or any other social environment are not the achievers. We're great, but it's actually the socializers. And the socializers are folks who are very motivated by community and very motivated by being able to connect with each other and like and comment and share and storytell. And so what WeSpire did to drive behavior change is that we used the power of the socializers and the social mechanics, to increase people's ability to do something. And for those people who are motivated by community to be able to connect and share and like with others, and then put the game mechanics to bring the achievers in, and ultimately then created a system that the vast majority of employees are motivated to participate in, whether they're achievers or socializers.
That's such a good point. Yeah. And you can't have one without the other, because if you only speak to the competitive people, like myself, I once told Ryan that I couldn't physically let my 6-year-old beat me at air hockey. I couldn't do it. I was like, it's the right thing to do. I should build her confidence. I should let her win a game, but I couldn't do it. But it's not just about those point chasers or those achievers or those competitive people. You have those influencers that just naturally have a big voice or kind of rise to the top as the influencers of the people, even if they aren't in per se elected positions.
Absolutely.
And we've experienced that as well. Yeah, it's a natural thing. And that fascinates me as well, because you can't always predict who that's going to be. there's people within an organization that you're like, I couldn't have pinned you for being the major influencer here, the one that I need to build a coalition with to get the following of the people, but here we are. So it totally makes sense. So in the spirit of having a diverse workforce and diverse employees, so DE&I, we talk a ton about DE&I. I feel like, at least in our circles, no one's going to argue that it's of the utmost importance. I've lived it as being, the only female on a board. I'm sure you've lived it as probably also being the only female on a board. I'm a believer. I know it. How do you, in the spirit of measurement and proving that it actually does, drive success or hit the bottom line, how do you actually quantify and measure the impact of DE&I, both in leadership as well as in the employee base?
Right. Well, I think it's important to separate out the measurement of diversity from the measurement of inclusion and the measurement of equity. Those are three very different things, and you need to measure them in very, very different ways. And diversity, the most common metrics, is to publish your diversity metrics. Just what is the composition of your workforce by division, by level, by role, board, non-board, things like that. And that's measurable. Equity, the biggest thing that gets talked about in equity is obviously pay equity, and looking at how women are paid relative to men. A big conversation in the G part of ESG is obviously the equity between executive compensation and frontline employee compensation, or the inequity that exists in many ways there, and around that. Where WeSpire really specializes is around inclusion, because inclusion is ultimately behavioral, and inclusion is ultimately tied very, very tightly to a concept called psychological safety. And whether or not, as an employee, I feel like when I come to work, I can take a risk, make a mistake without it being held against me, be myself, speak up, all the things that make a workplace safe. And thanks to Google, we know that those teams and those companies with the highest levels of psychological safety are the highest performing teams. They did a massive research study around high performing teams and found that psychological safety was key. And what we also know is psychological safety is really, really tied to inclusion. So what we try to do is improve the psychological safety of employees in the workplace, both by very specifically tackling the behaviors that are around psychological safety, but also by creating and facilitating groups of people coming together where they're going to find aspects of psychological safety in the workplace. So employee resource groups are very powerful for building and strengthening collegiate networks with both allies and members of that group, whether that's a parents group, whether that's a pride group, whether that's one of various different racial or gender-based groups. And we know that those groups tie to psychological safety as well as inclusion. So what we're really focused on is helping companies run the programs that actually drive the inclusive behaviors that improve ultimately psychological safety. And if we can show that psychological safety has improved, fortunately, others have done a great job proving that has driven business performance. There's also great data that diverse teams are the most successful teams, that gender balanced, for example, startups with gender balanced founding teams are more successful than those that don't have gender balance. There's great third-party data. But if I were, I am a CEO of my own company, but if I were advising any CEO, I would say, if you really focus on psychological safety and inclusion, ultimately you're going to have the highest performing organization. And what I love about that is it affects everyone. And this was something I learned at the New York Times, which is that when we went through some of our training, I co-led the diversity council there, and we went through a training where we talked a lot about in-the-house behaviors and out-of-the-house behaviors. And when we started to talk about where people were excluded most, what was fascinating is that it often wasn't race or gender based. In one case, it was union, non-union, and that union employees were just not included. And the contracts actually forbid certain types of inclusion in activities and knowledge sharing and things like that. And so there was this big us then thing, which I think is very common in environments that have both exempt and unionized employees. And that is a place where there's going to not be a sense of inclusion and not a sense of psychological safety. And so, how do we think about that in a broader way? And it also, I think, is inclusive of all of us having to acknowledge our biases, because everyone has biases. And one of the things that I have found most interesting about some of the work around anti-racism is talking about how we all have racist biases inside of us. This is not, just a problem of a majority group. And how do we all acknowledge that we need to address this, recognizing that there's systemic issues that make racial bias for certain groups way, way worse than others.
Yeah, I hope that of anything that people listening over the course of our podcast have gotten is how different the concept of diversity and inclusion are in a way, and that how easy in theory it is to build a plan to increase diversity, and how difficult it is to build an inclusive environment and all the intangible things and all the, I feel like that's a difficult thing to do, but hopefully that's what we're starting to work on more beyond just leveling out, the diversity.
Yeah. And we've worked with some very large, very well-known organizations who have done all the right things related to pay equity, diverse slate hiring, diverse slate cohorts coming in, who still have been not able to crack the gender equality in leadership puzzle. And when you got to the root of it, of what was driving it, and we did a lot of work with them to get to the root of what was driving it, it is very significant psychological safety differences between, for example, women and men in the workplace, or between members of underrepresented groups in the workplace and others. And that you really cannot ultimately change the outcomes you're looking to change unless, yes, you have to do all the things around diversity, but if you don't do all the things around inclusion, you're not going to solve the problem long term.
Yeah, so it's got to be really authentic effort towards
it's
behavior.
It is behavior, and behavior is hard to change, says someone who's a behavior scientist who runs a behavior change platform. This is hard stuff. We have very, very entrenched. But one of the reasons I love working with companies and workforces is actually the workplace is one of the places that we are most open to change and most understanding that we need to change. And that's kind of the positive of working with companies on these programs, is that most folks come into a workplace recognizing that there's a set of behaviors, cultures, values, and norms that you're expected to kind of fall in line with. And so people are more open and more receptive to new ways of thinking, much more so than I think if you were trying to do this at a community level.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So speaking of changing behavior, whose behavior do we have to change in this scenario here? There's a blog post, I think you or your team shared it. I don't know that you wrote it, but you shared it at least. Using sustainability to engage young professionals. And one of the quotes was, Generation Z, like the millennial generation before it, is pessimistic about careers, life in general, and the world around it.
It's beautiful. It's a beautiful sentiment.
It's concerning. Whose behavior needs to change to not be so concerned about that?
If you could physically see me, if this is a podcast, you would see that I'm pointing at all of us. I have a 17-year-old, so my 17-year-old is part of Gen Z. He'll be in the workforce in 5 years, and I hear this at home. And if you at all have paid attention to what Greta Thunberg and sort of folks that are literally walking out of school to protest now, what's happening is they do not feel like there's a future, and they do not feel like people who are in power, which is, the CEOs, which is you, Ryan, and me, and our cohorts of folks who run things, understand the urgency and are doing the things that we need to do. They are very rightly blaming us and holding us accountable and for the mess that we are in. And, you know, I think the way that I talk about it pretty regularly is we got 8 years. You know, we got 8 years to cut carbon emissions 50%, or it is going to be just, you know, it's already bad enough. Think about how bad it's going to be in 8 years if we don't make a substantial difference. And so, you know, they have every right to be holding us accountable, but we are the ones ultimately as business leaders who need to first and foremost change our behaviors. Second, we need to stop lobbying against the government, you know, against those kinds of things that are going to actually make dramatic changes at the government level, because government, when enabled, can be powerful and a powerful lever for change. Just look at what the US military could accomplish if they were actually given the go-ahead to make this happen. You know, and then we've got to cooperate at a global scale. And, you know, that because this is a planetary problem, not a US problem, not a Russia problem, not an EU problem. This is a planetary problem. And it's got thorny issues related to it. But ultimately, the behavior that needs to change is the behavior of everyone who's in charge of anything right now on this planet.
Well said and agreed on all accounts.
Yeah. Agreed. And I like that the children are standing up for what they believe in. I don't know. I feel like they're doing something. So maybe as pessimistic as they are about the world and life in general, at least they got some fight in them, and that's something. So
they do, and they have parents who are in positions of influence, you know, and so we hear this all the time in the corporate world, which is, you know, my son thinks we're destroying the world, and you know. Might not be wrong, you know. So what are you going to do about that? You know,
exactly.
And I think there is a, you know, we are well past this is not a problem. Something like 90% of Americans believe that climate change is real and that it is a giant problem. We are now in the stage where, oh my God, change is hard, and the kind of changes that we need, if we're trying to all do this individually on our own motivation, are not. You know, it's not going to be fast enough. And so the kind of levers that need to be pulled are the kind of levers that enable dramatic mass, essentially system change and design change, because you would rather have sustainability be the default. I point to something just totally minor, but at the same time, so exemplary of what it is, which is every single washing machine that is sold comes with the default being warm. You know, if we just, as an industry broadly, said every washing machine being sold is going to come with the default as cold, you know, or every dishwasher that the default is air dry, you know, or what we're starting to talk about, which is every new home is not tied into natural gas, or every, you know, car being sold is electric, you know, which enables obviously more renewable grid. You know, those are the kinds of defaults that enable mass behavior change at scale. And that doesn't mean that what we each do individually doesn't matter. It's our only choice right now. We've got to get to a place where the default choice is the sustainable choice.
I love that. Those are such powerful examples, and I totally agree. You know, no one's taking away your options, right? People get threatened when they feel like they're losing their control over things, but like you can still wash your clothes on hot. You just have to make a conscious decision to do so. I love that. So you talked about 8 years from now, and there is a lot of hype around net zero. And what we see, you know, in our space is a lot of our customers own commercial real estate. Is the pressure on the built environment, or someone a higher up made a commitment to net zero by X year. And then you get the folks below that tactically have to do something about it, right? They're like, okay, so we've publicly committed to this goal. Now apparently it's my job to go. And like I said, in our context, it's improve or fix my buildings, because I'm a commercial real estate owner. You had mentioned, you know, employees are the key to net zero success. And that's something that I think that at least our customer base thinks of secondarily. So how do employees play into this, and how can employees help get to those net zero goals?
Yeah. So certainly facility leaders, you know, first of all, they call them occupants. They don't even call them people, you know? And so it's like, oh, let's do occupant engagement. It's like, no, these are human beings and these are people with passions and interests. Let's start calling them people and thinking about them as such. But there is a lot, honestly, that a facility leader can do that doesn't require a lot of employee engagement. And that is great. That will hold them in good stead for a couple of years. They can do their purchase power agreements, and they can change out their lighting, and they can do insulation, and they can, do all those things. But for you to hit that goal, you ultimately need to unlock innovation at a level and scale that you've never, as a facilities leader, had to do before. And you're not going to do that unless you get every single person thinking about, how do we make this workplace a more sustainable workplace? Because the best ideas are sitting unlocked somewhere in your workforce for how to do this better, smarter, faster. And it's probably somebody who doesn't have the job title sustainability or the job title facilities, because we've all brought in our biases, brought in our, this is all the way it's already done, and all of this. It's going to be that person who sees the problem with fresh eyes that's going to have it. So I see the most powerful reason for engaging employees, particularly in sustainability initiatives, is to unlock that innovation and those new ideas. And that is what it's going to take to hit net zero in this time frame, is that creativity.
Yeah, well, Susan, Helee, I really appreciate the conversation, and I could have it for hours. And the fact that the three of us as leaders, are getting the finger pointed at us to do what we can is understood. And I hope that we remain committed. We can't keep talking though, because a fan favorite feature of ours is a game, and we all know we're achievers here and that we love games. So we have to play this game before we run out of time, Susan. So I've got just one question. You essentially have a 50-50 chance. It's just one question. I'm going to give you a couple clues though. The question is beans or beer. Does this place make craft beer or craft coffee? That's all you got to guess. Beans or beer. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. It's coming in the winter of 2022. It's going to be located in Maverick Square in the Boston area. And it says this: Hi, Eastie. I guess they're called the Easties out there. Do you know? Okay. Hi, Eastie. We can't wait to meet you. It's a sustainable focus. They talk about zero waste, giving back, and equitable pay. And the place is called Iterum. What do you think they do?
Coffee.
That's right. Cafe Iterum, coming in winter 2022. I'm plugging them. I hope they're as sustainable as they play. Congratulations, Achiever. You were correct.
Now, I have to ask, because you said that with such conviction and confidence, did you know, or were you just going with the 50-50 shot with that much conviction?
Just by what topics? Pay equity was the one that tilted me off, that is more likely to be a high resonant issue for coffee drinkers and for coffee owners than, for whatever reason, beer.
Ooh, interesting. So actual
clever
context
analysis
clues.
that works.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Well done.
But not
Well
surprising. In the company of someone as brilliant and accomplished as you, I mean it from the bottom of my heart. It was so nice to get to know you, and so interesting. And like Ryan said, could keep listening. And might. Yeah. And yes, thanks to our guest Susan today, and thanks to our hundreds of thousands of listeners for joining us on the ESG Experience podcast. There's a new episode every month, so if you enjoyed your time with us, make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast directory. On our next episode, one of our very own Gobies, Hannah Nelson, no relation to the boss man, will be joining us to discuss the anthropological impact of ESG. Thank you to our loyal subscribers for continuing to listen and support our podcast. And of course, you can continue the conversation between episodes on your favorite social media channel at #ESG Experience.